There is somebody with a very large microphone who shall remain nameless, and he told it wrong.
The mic, if you're dumb, only makes you sound dumber.
If you never have an interest in anything else I put out here, please help distribute this video.
You have the best violin in the world, but there's no music in it. You got to put the music. You have the best guitar. What good is it if you don't put the music into it? There's no music in it. And it's in you.
And we're coming up close on the home of the late Maestro Kyle. So if you look at that top second floor, right here on the corner, and out right in the front of the house, you see a window. You see a 3-pane window that sticks out right there? Yeah. That is the window that me, Jeff Tate from Queensryche, Lane Staley from Alice in Chains, Ann Wilson from Heart, many others, hundreds of other people would train. Chris Cornell from Soundgarden, Audio Slave, Ronnie Monroe, Liza Minnelli. I don't want to sound corny, but it's history. I mean, all those people trained and sang through that window out to the bay.
Music is your future. Do the best with everything.
I want to help you be the best that you can be wherever you want to go with that. We're going to set the record straight once and for all about Jimi Hendrix's one-off guitar effects pedal, what transpired in the early part of 1967 following his meeting with a man named Roger Mayer, and why we should really care and why all of us should care. This is not just some trick for the pros or some obscure information that bears no relevance whatsoever to the amateur.
You're telling them the story. You're expressing it to them. Them.
So this is the story of the Octavia. This is Roger in 1975 in the studio with the console that he built. Roger was and is a total electronics wizard, and we can get into a little bit about that later as it has some relevance to the relationship with Jimi Hendrix. But for right now, here's Roger a few years before that, in the early part of 1968, on the road with the Experience. I've never met Roger Mayer, I've never spoken with him on the phone, I have never received any favors from Roger, any free gear, and that's fine. The reason I mention this is that the video I'm responding to wasn't using Roger Mayer pedals. I won't say which pedals they were using, but again, the whole YouTube thing is constantly suspicious. Maybe if we're talking about Roger Mayer, we should be using some Roger Mayer pedals and sourcing the history as documented by Roger himself. Now, Roger met Jimi on January 11th, 1967, a few days after Roger's 21st birthday. Then the first use of it on record was on February 3rd. So just within the span of about 3 weeks. How it happened was that Roger had seen Jimi on Ready Steady Go, and he'd heard about Jimi in the London circle. He had a fast-growing reputation. Jimi arrived in London in September of 1966. But January 11th is when Roger meets Jimi of 67, and he went up to Jimi after the gig, and he introduced himself. And this is a critical piece of correction to the video I'm responding to. Roger did not design the Octavia for Jimi. Roger was already working on the Octavia, and he went up to Jimi after the gig, and he started talking to him, and within about 5 minutes, they realized they'd both hit it off. They were both into science fiction. Roger said, I'm really into guitar sound, and I've worked with Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page, and he'd been working with the London guitar players. And Roger said, I've got this brand new device that I'm working on that's going to be perfect. I really think you can handle it. And Jimi said, what's it about? In the video that inspired this little response, the Octavia effect was described as, quote, just a radio handbook frequency doubler. Unfortunately, more internet misinformation and simplification for people consuming YouTube videos on their iPhones on the toilet. Does anyone use Google at all before they hit record and make a YouTube video now? It's right there in the search engine results page. You don't even have to go to the website. Roger describes the Octavia as, well, having properties of a frequency doubler, also properties of an envelope generator and an amplitude modulator. Now, electronically and scientifically, I don't really care about that, but I care about the sound, and we care about the sound. And the way that Roger describes it sonically is a mirror image of the sound that exists right now. So if you think of that graphically, and again, I'm just quoting things Roger has already said on an interview that got buried under bad SEO and, these YouTubers that are rising to the top of the algorithm, and the truth is getting squashed. The image is just like if you take an image and you put it in front of two mirrors, you have an infinite series of images. I used to live in a room full of mirrors. All I could see was me. Hendrix quotes are strong. So it's a mirror image. Well, the first recorded uses of the Octavia effect were indeed on Fire and on Purple Haze. That overdub date was not at Electric Ladyland, the studio. That studio didn't even exist yet. So let's rewind just a little bit and catch ourselves back up with the rest of this story. So Roger goes and meets Jimmy for the first time in January 1967 at the Bag of Nails. They hit it off after the gig. They both like science fiction. They're both into the way that sound affects people. And Roger tells Jimmy about this new device that he was already working on, was not designed for Jimi Hendrix. I realize that's a smaller detail, but the details matter, right? If you're playing guitar, if you're learning a piece of music, whatever you're doing, details matter. What's the thing Leonard Cohen said in that great interview with Paul Zolo, who was a great interviewer, put out that book, Songwriters on Songwriting, and Leonard talked about how important the detail is, like in a lyric. It's better to say the oak than the tree. Yeah, details matter a whole lot. So, anyhow, Roger and Jimmy hit it off, and Jimmy says, why don't you bring this new device to a club I'm playing at in a couple weeks? And that club was outside of London, in Kent, at the Chislehurst Caves. And so a few weeks go by, and Roger takes the Octavia to Jimmy at the gig, and he has a little practice amp in the dressing room. And so Jimmy plugs in through this new effect, and he goes, that's unbelievable. It's going to be perfect. I have a couple new songs, certainly one, maybe a couple, coming up that I need to do the overdubs on, and I want to use that. So I've got a gig in a couple more weeks, and I think that one was at the Ricky Tick Club. Why don't you bring the Octavia to that gig, and after the gig, we'll go by at Olympic Studios, okay? It was recorded at Olympic, not at Electric Ladyland, and we'll do the overdubs. Well, there certainly was a Helios mixing console in Olympic Studios. There wasn't a company Helios in 1967. The video in question that's racking up many more views by the tens of thousands as we speak also gets this wrong. I'm really not trying to be a jerk, and I'm not trying to be a contrarian. It just boggles my mind and distresses me how wrong some of these people with the big microphone are telling it. Okay, here's the deal. The Helios mixing console wound up in Olympic in Studio 2 after being commissioned in 1969. Purple Haze and Fire were recorded in February. February 3rd was the overdub date at Olympic of 1967. Where's the Helios console? The video in question does say correctly that the original Octavia had limited drive capabilities, and then it goes on to say that, therefore, Roger paired this original incarnation of the Octavia with the Helios mic pre to give it the extra drive that Jimmy wanted. What the documented truth of the matter is that Roger built a separate enclosure in a separate box that he paired with the Octavia to give the effect the additional drive and EQ that Jimmy needed. And after that session, he consigned the original Octavia to the trash bin. Now the Helios misinformation. Dick Sweetenham was the technical director at Olympic Studios, and he was a technician and an engineer, and he designed the consoles for the studio. In 1968, Glenn Johns, the famed engineer and producer, I knew of his work through his work on the Rolling Stones records, just recorded a ton of bands, ton of classic rock records everybody would know. Glenn Johns persuaded him to leave Olympic and to form the company with Chris Blackwell. Island Records wanted a console, and out of that, Helios, the company, was born. Then Studio 2 at Olympic commissioned the first Helios mixing console. So yes, did Hendrix use a Helios mic pre? Sure, of course. But in 1967, what was really happening? Well, if you just go to the Helios website, you'll find out, yeah, in Studio 1 around 1967, there would have been a pre-Helios design. Is that essentially a Helios mic pre, well, kind of. Would have been the same guy that was designing this stuff. But as far as Roger Mayer pairing the Octavia because it didn't have enough drive capabilities with the Helios, you'd better talk to Eddie Kramer instead about that. Eddie the engineer. And both Eddie Kramer and Roger Mayer are still around, so you might think that if you're a big-time YouTuber, you might reach out in sincerity and say, I want to interview you, Mr. Kramer, and have you on the channel and get to the bottom of this. Personally, I would have absolutely have loved that, especially if speaking with either of those guys had helped to shed some light on and possibly clarify some of the conflicting accounts and confusion about the next thing that I noticed in the video that I'm responding to. Somebody had asked about how to set the Octavia and where to place it in your effects chain. And the answer that was given was that most of the time with an Octavia, the idea is to turn the drive all the way down, like completely off. And then, if you need additional gain, to stack gain pedals after it. I thought that was an error at first, because it didn't match up with what I'd always thought based on the information directly on Roger's website. When you go to Roger's website, he clearly states that the idea is to put the fuzz and the wah before the Octavia, and that Jimi used it that way, like on the solo to Purple Haze. However, there's a photograph of Jimi around the time of the Band of Gypsies shows where we can clearly see his pedals and how they're connected on the floor. In that photo, there's no two ways around it. The guitar is going into the wah-wah, right out of the wah-wah, into the Octavia, then onto the fuzz, and last, the Univibe. This bothered me enough that I went looking for details. Could my 30 years of scrutiny have been just wrong? To corroborate my initial suspicion, and also the fact that we probably should listen to Roger Mayer when he was there with Jimi that night, I also found to support my theory that between the time of the Purple Haze session and the Band of Gypsies shows, which you have to remember was about a period of 3 years, Jimi probably just changed his setup, and sure enough, I found a fantastic website that documents all of this. Jimi got his wah-wah in the spring of 1967. I always heard early on, reading Guitar Player magazine as a kid, that it was after Jimi heard the recording of Tales of Brave Ulysses by Cream, and he was very inspired by Clapton's use of the wah-wah. And it was known that Jimi would use the wah before the fuzz, and it was a winning combination. This website that I found, that I will also source in the pinned comment, confirms that yes, that was the combination, and also if you look at the footage of the Stockholm concert from 1969, you can also see where the Strat is obviously going into the wah-wah, and the fuzz is right after it. Jimi has these effects too far apart from one another, and as he gets ready to introduce Voodoo Child's Slight Return, he has to move them closer to one another. If we're talking about the Band of Gypsies, yes, stack gain pedals after the Octavia. If you're talking about early Hendrix, no, you want to run the Octavia after the fuzz, and if you're going kind of into Axis Bold as Love, go wah, fuzz, then Octavia. Roger's account is pretty much the first thing that should carry the most weight, I think. Of course, he was there with Jimi that night after the gig when they went over to Olympic. And then there are some major clues when you look at the Stockholm footage from 1969. And combined with the fact that it's widely known Hendrix used wah before fuzz, and that implies wah-wah into fuzz. It doesn't imply wah-wah into something else eventually gets to the fuzz. Speaking of gain and its effect on the Octavia sound, in that video 3 examples were given. During the solo on Who Knows on the Band of Gypsies, yeah, absolutely, Octavia did make an appearance. And of course, the solos for Purple Haze and Fire. Of course, between me and you, there are plenty of other uses we could have pointed towards. But the sound of those examples that he gave are quite different. Now, the units would have been quite different also because Roger changed the Octavia, built different Octavias. As we mentioned earlier, after that first session, the original unit was consigned to the trash bin. And the one, by the way, he says in the Experience Music Project in Seattle, the one in the wedge-shaped box, really has no resemblance whatsoever with the one that was used on that early session on Purple Haze and on Fire. But on the Who Knows solo on Band of Gypsies, that's the sound of the Octavia pretty much with a clean guitar, and if you roll the tone back, get the sound darker on the tone control on your Strat, you get a ring modulated sound. That's noticeably different than if you put the fuzz before the Octavia, an upper octave double is created, and you really hear the sound quite a lot in general on the B and E strings, on the highest two strings, particularly above the 7th fret, and even more as you roll the tone down on the guitar. Like on Fire, what's interesting about that track is if you break it down, which is very easy to do on the stereo mix, it's just panned hard right and hard left for Jimmy's guitars. You notice, well, he double tracked that, and they're almost identical in the guitar parts, but just a little bit of variation, enough to give it some humanity and some variation. And then when the thing is mixed with one hard right, one hard left, it's really cool because what you hear in the end result is like this phantom center. But if you break that down, the left channel has the Octavia and a little bit less gain, and the right channel has the Octavia and a little bit more gain, and then it all blends together in the center. Somebody might be going like, why aren't you playing a Stratocaster on that little homage to Fire? Because Hendrix didn't. Okay, so Jimmy actually used a Telecaster on not one but two iconic tracks on the solos. On that session on February 3rd of '67, the solo for Fire and the solo for Purple Haze, he's playing a Telecaster. The reason for that was at the gig prior to the session, Jimmy was playing the Strat, and the club had a very, very low ceiling. And if you've ever seen footage of Hendrix on stage, of course, you know Hendrix, he went crazy on stage. And the ceiling was low, and anyhow, Stratocaster, it went through the ceiling. And when it went through the ceiling, the machine head got bent. And boom, right there, the high E string, it won't stay in tune. The guitar is effectively out of commission for a little while, and he's got to run off to a session. What are you going to do? So Jimmy wound up playing a borrowed Telecaster from one of Noel Redding's friends. Noel had to go home, find a friend, borrow a Telecaster, and it was that Telecaster that wound up in the studio that Hendrix was using that night, overdubbing the solos for Purple Haze and for Fire. And I think there's a really beautiful lesson in that as well that is really important for all of us to hear, and especially myself, because I'm as bad as anyone and worse than 99.9% of everyone. As far as gear, and really we get into this mindset of being a purist, and the real truth is, it's the performer, it's not the gear. The creative spirit finds a way. So they were in a situation where all of a sudden, times were tough. That one guitar, that was the guitar. And boom, he's got to run up to a session, can't use the guitar, and he winds up using a borrowed Telecaster on like two iconic tracks, and it's still Jimi Hendrix. Just remember that. I'll remember that too, but you remember that as well. It's a really good lesson for us to keep in mind, as we get into the minutia of all this other stuff that can really bog us down if we don't keep that in perspective. If you'd like to join my email list, it's completely free to do so, and from time to time, I'll be sending my subscribers some exclusive content that might not be anywhere here on the YouTube channel, but they're things that helped me that I'm certain will help you as well. And to join, it's really easy. All you do is you go over to the website, that's at fretboardplayground.com, and put in your name and email address. I don't need anything else, don't want anything else, don't get distracted by anything else on the website. You can just join the email list completely for free. And from time to time, I'll send you more stuff. I am going to try to also keep this YouTube channel updated very regularly, so if you haven't already subscribed to it and you're finding use in it and value in it and enjoying it, consider subscribing, and when you do, hit the notification bell so that you'll get the notifications when I put new stuff out. In the meantime, just have a lot of fun with the guitar, enjoy it every single day, and stay tuned. I'll see you really soon in the next video.
All the wrongs in the world don't make one right, but one right corrects the millions of wrongs. And if anyone says, what are you telling me? That my teacher said to do it, blame it entirely on your maestro.